Greetings. It's going to be an overview on instructional design. And one of the things that's comforting is that even in an online environment or an environment that's largely enhanced by the use of technology, good teaching still remains good teaching. So a lot of what many people have become comfortable with in a face-to-face kind of teaching environment also still is useful when we're using a technology-enhanced or completely online learning environment. There are a vast number and many different types of technology tools available that we might be able to use and avail ourselves of for instructional purposes. So one of the problems, and it's a great problem to have, is making sure that we use the technology tools that we actually need in order to teach. So we need to make our tool selection in the context of instructional design. In the text, The Technology Tool Belt for Teaching by Manning and Johnson, they present a decision-making matrix that will help with this issue of selecting the appropriate tools to accomplish our teaching. More on that in just a bit, but instructional design is the systematic process of translating principles of learning and instruction into plans for instructional materials and activities. You might have heard the term pedagogy discussed as you're reading through literature on education and instructional design. Pedagogy is derived from a Greek word for child, and pedagogy refers to theories and approaches to teaching and learning. But since it derives from that Greek word for child, many have said that when we're talking about adult teaching and learning, it would be more appropriate to use the term andragogy. So, pedagogy, andragogy, andragogy being learning strategies focused on adults, pedagogy more focused on children. But in many cases, regardless of age, people use the term pedagogy. The Ohio Learning Network, or the OLN, talks about principles of good practice, and in the principles of good practice there's information about institutional responsibilities, instructional responsibilities, instruction in courses, student support, as well as assessment practices. And all of these need to be taken into consideration as you develop educational programs that are going to be effective. The principles of good practice help us to think about some of the things that we should consider as we implement educational courses and programs. A while back, colleagues and I worked as a learning community on a project, and we implemented these principles of good practice as part of our learning community. And some research related to instructional design. A positive relationship was identified between student satisfaction and the level of dialogue with the course instructor and dialogue with other students, as well as students' perception of course structure or how the course was set up. This information was published in some research that I conducted with Dr. John Hirschbill, and the article was titled Effective Learner Attributes, Dialogue, and Course Structure on Student Satisfaction and Performance in Online Allied Health Courses, which was published in the Journal of Interactive Instruction Development, if you want to read more about it. Online courses with appropriate structure and adequate dialogue may help to minimize the detrimental effect of technology-related problems on students' learning and increase student satisfaction. So it's very important that you design courses, especially online courses, with appropriate structure and provide for adequate opportunities for dialogue, because these may help to minimize some of the issues associated with technology and help alleviate student problems so that students will be more satisfied with the course and their learning experience. We also conducted some research with colleagues, Dr. Mikanovitz, Chang, and Solero, and we chose to take a look at student and faculty expectations regarding feedback. And we were comparing online course experiences with traditional course experiences. And what we found were that more students expected the time, as expressed in days, more students expected the time to receive a response or feedback from an instructor should be shorter for a course offered online than for those courses in the face-to-face learning environment. And prior to this research, we had often suspected that. In our study, communications by email, the mode response was 1 to 2 days, and by phone, the mode response was also 1 to 2 days. There are a number of models to guide the instructional design process. In this model here by Dick and Carey, we see that we assess needs to identify goals for the educational program or the instructional module that you're developing, conduct instructional analysis, analyze learners and context, and from there we write performance objectives, develop instruments to assess whether or not these performance objectives have been met, develop the instructional strategies to be utilized, then develop and select instructional materials to accomplish this, design and conduct formative evaluation of instruction after you've gotten the students involved in the training or the participants involved in the educational process, and then design and conduct summative evaluations. And formative evaluations are done for the purpose of providing feedback and making some changes. Summative evaluations are done at the completion of the program and are done so that you can get a final, how did we do sort of thing. So if you want to think about it, quizzes, midterms are more of formative evaluations as you go through a traditional semester-long course. The final exam is really a final assessment of, hey, did we do it? How did we do overall? So not the final exam being a summative evaluation, not so much for providing feedback to make changes, but to give you an overall rating. And then this process goes back and repeats itself, analyzed again, and then continue to revise instruction. So that's the Dick and Carey system approach for instructional design. There are others. In the ADDIE model, one of the first steps is to analyze, similar to Dick and Carey's initial approach. Then design the program, develop the resources and materials that you'll need to implement it, finally implement it, and then once implemented, conduct evaluation. And you see throughout the process that revision takes place between these various steps. So there's a lot of commonalities between these instructional design models. The key is to use a model as you go through the instructional design process. Then a generalized model for program planning can also be of value here, this one by Cottrell and others. First step, understanding and engaging, assessing the needs of the learners, then setting goals and objectives for the program that you're trying to develop, developing an intervention, implement the intervention, and then evaluate the results. When we think about needs, you need to consider who is the target audience, who are you trying to design the program or educational system for. Think about age, sex, cultural background, language, things that you'll need to consider about the potential participants for the program so that you make sure that you have the proper resources and design the program appropriately to accommodate their needs. Think also of the number of students or participants that you're anticipating. And think of the level of interactivity that you want to have involved and how you're going to accomplish that given the size of the group involved. You also need to think of the general abilities of the participants or of the group that you're going to be conducting the education with. Think about potential for interactivity among the participants in the class or the program. And then identify essential course content so that you make sure that you address all the different topics that are appropriate for the course. Let's talk just a bit about one philosophy of education, that's constructivism. Constructivists believe that knowledge is constructed, not transmitted. So I can't just teach you everything you need to know. You have to construct this knowledge for yourself. People try to reconcile new knowledge with what they currently know. So we can't really teach others what we know because our experiences are different, and that each person interprets experiences in terms of their own beliefs and knowledge. Knowledge construction results from activity. And these are some of the premises of constructivism. Constructivists believe that knowledge is anchored in and indexed by the context in which it's learned. So meaning is in the mind of the knower. There are multiple perspectives on the world, and meaning making is prompted by a problem, a question, confusion, disagreement, or dissonance, a need or desire to know. And so it involves personal ownership of that problem. When we look at constructivist versus traditional learning methods, in the constructivist method, again, knowledge is constructed, it's emergent, it's situated in action or experience, and it's distributed. In the traditional learning method, knowledge is transmitted, it's external to the knower. It's objective, stable, fixed, it's decontextualized. I can tell you what you need to know, so to speak. The constructivist views reality as a product of the mind. And traditional learning methods view reality as more external to the knower. The constructivist reflects perceptions and understanding of experiences when they're trying to derive meaning. In the traditional sense, reflect on the external world to form meaning or derive meaning. As far as symbols, the constructivist views symbols as tools for constructing reality. Traditional approach would be that symbols represent the world. Constructivists would take an approach to instruction that would involve reflecting multiple perspectives, increasing complexity, diversity. It's a bottom-up kind of process, inductive, apprenticeship, modeling, coaching, exploration, and learner-generated. These are the types of instructional strategies a constructivist approach might take. Whereas a more traditional approach might be to simplify knowledge, use abstract rules, basics first, top-down, deductive application of symbols, rules and principles, lecturing, tutoring, more instructor-derived and controlled, more individual and competitive types of approaches to instruction. When you're designing a program or involved in instructional design, you need to consider your teaching philosophy. Then develop goals and objectives to accomplish what you want others to learn, or to provide an opportunity for them to learn, and develop the teaching strategies and media necessary. And consider the different types of teaching methods and strategies you want to use. I am a big fan of a constructivist approach. I like learning to be active and have people actually doing a lot of projects as opposed to just listening to lectures and taking tests. Although you'll see within this class there are a mixture of different instructional techniques and strategies. Think about how you'll use them, and then how will you communicate with and present information to the participants or students in the program that you're designing. Think about different types of content, written, audio, video, and interactive content that you can make available to the participants. In the back of your mind, of course, you have to consider the different types of technology that will be needed to accomplish all of this. Technical considerations, you'll need to think about things like the type of computer system. In this class, as you read through the syllabus, you'll see that you're going to need a computer that's capable of multimedia, both producing some multimedia as well as playing it. You'll also need to think about things like plugins. If you're going to create content that requires different types of plugins in order for people to be able to view it or experience or access it, such as Adobe Acrobat Reader, Real Player, Flash, different types of plugins depending on what type of format you put that media out in. You'll need to think about bandwidth available to the participants and requirements. Do you need really high-speed connections, or will wireless connections work? And then you'll need to think about the types of participants you have. What kind of technical or computer skills are they going to need in order to fully participate in the instructional program that you're developing? You may even consider a self-assessment examination or a readiness inventory for students, especially those involved in learning at a distance. Design considerations, you'll need to think about aspects of visual literacy as you create materials and create the course. Think about your audience, their characteristics, education, experience, their learning styles, whether they're more kinesthetic or visual or audio learners. And one of the approaches I take is to try and present media in various formats to accommodate different learning styles. When you're developing materials, think about the text, the fonts that you're using, the size of the text, and the layout. You want things to be clear. It doesn't do any good to develop something really fancy and beautiful if people can't read it. Writing for the web, you'll want to use a lot of headings and chunk material rather than providing real large blocks of information all at once. When you put images into different media that you're constructing, remember that file size is important. It's nice to have high quality media, but you also have to remember that in many cases the higher quality is going to result in a larger file size, so there's always a balancing act there. You want high quality materials, but you also want it to be of the size that people can readily download. So you need to balance that quality with size. Many times you'll be using JPEGs, file formats for photos, and GIF images for text, graphics, or art, or PNG, portable network graphic files. And then you'll need to consider accessibility, images, or issues, I apologize there. Accessibility, when we're thinking about images, we need to put alternative text behind the images so that people who are using screen readers will be able to have that description of the image read to them rather than just some benign file name. More on that later. Accessibility for video, we can make video more accessible for folks if we used closed captioning. Provide text descriptions of the audio and video that might be available. And in web considerations, developing sites that are accessible. If we're teaching online or presenting information online, many times we're going to have to do a lot of planning so that things are well laid out, well structured for the participants. So more planning may be required of an online course than something you're going to present in person. Be sure to define the scope of the program or educational course that you're developing. Develop goals, objectives, and learning outcomes. You'll see these in this course reflected in the course syllabus and in each module. Identify the characteristics of the learners or the participants likely to avail themselves of the educational program that you're developing. Make sure that you establish constraints or set the scope of the program. You'll need to determine costs, both financial costs as well as costs in terms of time and effort that are going to be required to pull this off. Then determine and collect the resources, do some brainstorming, define the look and feel of the course or educational program that you're developing, create lesson plans, and then plan how you're going to assess whether or not your objectives have been met. How are you going to evaluate whether the learners have truly achieved what they need to achieve? You might also consider, and it's a good idea to consider, evaluations that the learners can do of the instructors themselves and of the facilities and the program in general. Did it really meet their needs? So you want to develop evaluations that are going to assess whether the learners achieved what you wanted them to do, but you should also plan an evaluation system for the learners to give you feedback as the instructor as to how well this program met their needs. In the development phase, you're going to want to prepare and produce program elements, things such as text. You might have handouts, instructional sheets. If it's an online course, they may be available to print. Think about audio, graphics, and video, and then put everything together. It's good to do an alpha test before you roll the thing out for prime time. Revise it, do a beta test, get a small pilot group maybe. Revise again, make sure that you validate, make sure that the program is going to do what you need it to do, and then finally get that thing rolled out. In the implementation phase, you'll want to have a syllabus, or at least the components of a syllabus, and then consider adding additional guidelines for procedures and maybe expectations that you have of the learners, as well as the schedule and other information that would go into a typical syllabus. And you can get a good idea by looking at the syllabus for this course. You'll want to provide some sort of orientation to the online learning environment. The link below on this slide, at the lower portion of this slide, describes implementing the 7 principles of good practice in undergraduate education using technology as a lever. And it's a great resource to avail yourself of. It goes through the 7 principles of good education, and it talks about how you can implement technology to accomplish those. You're going to need to go through the evaluation phase, and when you're evaluating student performance, you need to make sure that your evaluation methods are appropriate for course objectives and outcomes that you're trying to reach. Research papers, reflective or reaction papers, short answer essay questions, objective types of tests, case studies, all of these can be used as appropriate for the different types of objectives and outcomes. Those objectives and outcomes also have to be set for the level or type of course. Certainly, different types of outcomes and objectives are associated with graduate level education as opposed to undergraduate education, as an example. You'll also want to consider constructivist approaches such as papers, quizzes, web quests, research projects, and presentations. I'm a big fan of rubrics so that you can allow your learners to know what the expectations are and how they'll be scored in an evaluation system. I think that allowing users to have this information, participants to have this information up front, increases your chances of having a good evaluation outcome. And that's important to both you as an instructor and the students. In applying instructional design, keep in mind everything should focus on the purpose of the course, the goals or objectives that are to be reached. You'll need to think about teaching methods or techniques, the types of technology that are to be utilized, because no matter what, you're going to use some sort of technology. And then the strategies you want to use for accomplishing this. Think about things such as discussions, quizzes, problem-based learning exercises, web quests, videos, different types of strategies you can use in the instruction process. Think about strategies for implementation. You'll need to obtain, create media, materials, worksheets, different types of resources, and then the evaluation phase. In the Technology Tool Belt for Teaching by Manning and Johnson, they describe a decision-making matrix for selecting technology tools. And one of the key things to keep in mind is to consider how well the tool will help you to reach your course goals and objectives for the course. And they talk about things such as the type of the tool, the problem that it will solve. Think about costs. And when you think about costs, think not just in terms of dollars and cents, but think also of the cost in terms of time and effort involved. Provide a URL to any information related to the type of tool, a description of the tool. You might want to consider the platform, whether it's going to be utilized in an online environment or more of a face-to-face or traditional type of environment. And I'm thinking we're going to have to get away from that traditional kind of terminology at some point, because online is becoming pretty traditional itself. What is that type of tool best used for? Think about cautions, and then how you're going to overcome any of the cautions that might be associated with that tool. Think about accessibility concerns. Will it be available to learners of all different types of abilities? And then special equipment or technical requirements that might be necessary to utilize that tool. Also consider the reliability of the tool and or the vendor or service provider. Any additional vocabulary, training and resources that might be needed, and the level of expertise that will be necessary in order to properly utilize the tool. You can also think about whether or not it can be utilized in a synchronous versus an asynchronous learning environment. When we talk about synchronous learning, it means that people have to be engaged at the same time in order for the learning opportunity to take place. If we're doing Skype, for example, both people have to be available to have that conversation or interaction, whereas asynchronous tools allow the learning and communications to take place in an asynchronous fashion. We don't have to be available at the same time. Asynchronous tools include things like discussions. I can post a thread or topic today. You could decide to read it and respond to it tomorrow. I can go back in and look at another given time and respond back to you. So we can have an asynchronous interaction. Both tools are useful. Both different types of formats are useful, but you need to think about those as you're thinking about the type of course and even your users. If your users don't want to meet at the same given time, you don't want to have a lot of synchronous tools in place. I just want to talk just briefly, we've mentioned this a number of times on different slides, but you want to make sure that the resources you use are accessible to a large variety of users, and users of different abilities. The organization webaim.org has a lot of useful information there, so make sure that you check that out. It's good practice to make sure that your resources meet accessibility standards. Too many tools, this is a good problem to have. It can be an issue, but make sure that whatever you select to use, that you select it based on the need to accomplish the goals and objectives of the course. If you do that, you can't go wrong. Enjoy the day. Bye.